The evening was meant to be elegant, predictable. Crystal chandeliers bathed the marble floors of the Willard Hotel's grand ballroom in soft gold, and a string quartet hummed quietly as guests in gowns and tuxedos mingled over champagne. The event was a bipartisan charity gala titled Harmony for America, a tasteful attempt to bridge the cultural divide between politics and the arts. It was the kind of night where controversy was dressed in politeness and everyone pretended, for a few hours, to agree on something. Pam Bondi stood near the back of the room, sipping a glass of sparkling water. She wore a tailored, deep purple suit that made her stand out effortlessly amid the sea of black and white. Her presence drew glances, some admiring, others skeptical, but she didn't mind. She was used to being the most unexpected person in the room. That night, she had come only to observe, to support a cause she believed in, and to enjoy a rare evening away from the usual firestorms of television panels and political briefings. The stage was set for the headline act, a solo piano performance by Sebastian Hale, a rising star in the classical scene and a vocal progressive. Known as much for his music as for his social commentary, Sebastian had gained a cult following online, praised for blending political themes into his compositions, and criticized for using concerts as platforms for ideological jabs. As he took the stage, he smiled with practiced charm, adjusted the mic and offered his opening remarks. "Thank you all for coming. It's beautiful to see people from all walks of life united for something that actually matters." Applause followed. Then his tone shifted. "And in times like these, when culture and art are often misunderstood by those who only speak, in legislation and litigation, we need music more than ever to remind us of humanity." There it was, subtle, but clear enough to sting. Pam felt it. So did a few others, who turned their heads slowly toward her. Sebastian didn't name names. He didn't need to. The insinuation hung in the air like a dissonant chord. She took another sip and smiled, small, calculated. The music began. It was impressive. A powerful blend of Chopin technique with postmodern flair. Fast runs, sudden shifts in tempo, rich harmonies. Sebastian played like someone who knew the world was watching, and he wanted to be sure no one forgot who owned the spotlight. But something had changed. Pam's eyes remained fixed on the piano, not with anger, not even defiance, with curiosity. Then quietly, she leaned toward Elena, her longtime advisor seated beside her. "He's good," she whispered. "But let's see how he handles a challenge." Elena looked at her. "Pam, no." But the idea had already bloomed. Pam stood up, setting her glass on the table with deliberate grace. She walked toward the stage, her heels echoing like a drum roll on the hardwood floor. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Sebastian looked up, confused, then amused. The pianist stepped back slightly as Pam reached the microphone. She adjusted it, smiled and said, "Mr. Hale, that was passionate, but I'd like to propose something." The room went still, a challenge, one piece each, no politics, just piano. Sebastian blinked, then grinned. Challenge accepted. The room buzzed with low voices and raised eyebrows as Pam Bondi stood calmly at the center of the stage, her presence commanding despite the fact that she wasn't even supposed to be there. She hadn't rehearsed. She hadn't brought sheet music. And yet she had just challenged one of the most celebrated young pianists in Washington to a musical duel in his own arena. Sebastian Hale stepped forward, the polished performer in him unable to resist the spotlight. He raised an eyebrow, amused, and leaned toward the mic. "I'm honored," he said with an exaggerated bow, "but are you sure you want to do this? Politics and piano are very different instruments." Pam smiled. "You're absolutely right. One takes discipline, patience, and soul. The other takes applause." That jab landed with precision, drawing laughter and scattered applause from the audience. Sebastian's grin tightened slightly. A man from the event committee rushed to the stage, whispering frantically to the MC, unsure whether to intervene. But the crowd's curiosity had turned into anticipation. Phones were already out, filming, live streams had begun. What started as a formal gala was quickly becoming a showdown, and no one was leaving their seat. The MC adjusted his mic and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, in the spirit of good fun and great music, we'll now have a friendly piano exchange. Mr. Hale will begin. Ms. Bondi will follow. One piece each, let the music speak." Sebastian didn't hesitate. He sat at the piano, flexed his fingers, and launched into a complex, modern arrangement of Rhapsody in Blue. His performance was technically brilliant, full of dramatic flourishes, swift runs, and theatrical pauses. He played not just to impress, but to dominate, to make a statement. "This is my world, and you don't belong here." The audience was enthralled. He finished with a flourish, stood up, and gave a gracious, smug nod toward Pam. The applause was thunderous. Pam didn't flinch. She walked slowly toward the piano, her fingers brushing the edge of the polished black lid as she sat down. No introduction, no explanation, just silence. Her hands hovered above the keys for a moment, and then, without warning, she began. The first notes were soft, minimalist, but they carried weight. She played a delicate prelude in E minor, transitioning seamlessly into an improvised blend of classical phrasing and jazz-influenced rhythms. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy, but it had depth. It told a story. As the first few measures filled the air, the room seemed to change. Phones lowered, conversations stopped. Even Sebastian, arms crossed at the side of the stage, slowly uncrossed them. Whatever this was, it wasn't what anyone expected, and she had only just begun. Sebastian Hale returned to the bench, this time with renewed purpose. His first performance had been part of the scheduled program, controlled, rehearsed, polished, but now this was personal. Pam Bondi had issued a challenge on his stage in front of his peers, and worst of all, she had drawn applause before playing a single note. It was a threat not just to his ego, but to the idea that genius belonged only to the artistic elite. And he wasn't about to lose that ground. He flexed his fingers once more, cracked his knuckles, a deliberate gesture, and glanced at the audience with the confidence of a man who believed in nothing more than his own superiority. Then, with a sharp inhale, he placed his hands on the keys. The first chord struck like lightning, bold, aggressive, full of intention. He launched into a dark, rhythmic interpretation of La Campanella by Liszt, layered with his own contemporary embellishments. He added dissonant harmonies, offbeat accents, and moments of suspended silence designed to unnerve as much as impress. And it worked. The audience was captivated. His fingers blurred across the keys with dazzling speed, hammering out-octave leaps, arpeggios, and crashing clusters. This wasn't just music, it was a performance. His entire body moved with the rhythm. Hunched shoulders, sharp turns of the head, dramatic pauses between sections, as if summoning emotion from the ether. Each note felt deliberate, weaponized. But there was something else. Underneath the bravado, behind the ferocity of the notes, there was an edge of desperation. He wasn't just playing to win, he was playing to crush, to remind everyone, including himself, that talent wasn't up for debate, that his domain was sacred, untouchable. He hit the final chord with both hands, holding it just long enough to let the resonance ring out. Then slowly, he stood and bowed, arms open in self-assured triumph. The crowd rose to its feet with a roar of applause, whistles and cheers echoing off the ballroom walls. Cameras flashed. A few attendees clapped a little too hard, like they wanted the story to end there. Sebastian turned toward Pam, now seated off to the side, and offered a mock-polite gesture toward the piano. "Your move," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. Pam gave no visible reaction. She stood, walked to the piano slowly, deliberately, and paused for a second as Sebastian stepped back. Their eyes met. His gaze said, "Follow that." Hers replied, "I will." She sat, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands gently on the keys. No theatrics, no flexing, no fanfare, just stillness. And then she began to play. The first notes from Pam Bondi's hands were quiet, almost too quiet, for the size of the room. A soft, contemplative melody unfolded across the piano, each note given space to breathe. She played slowly, deliberately, as if the keys themselves were old friends. The contrast to Sebastian's bombastic finale was immediate and jarring. But within moments, something shifted. People stopped shifting in their seats. Phones, once raised to record a spectacle, were lowered unconsciously. Conversations at the back of the ballroom faded into silence. The energy in the room turned inward. Pam wasn't trying to impress. She was trying to connect. Her piece wasn't one anyone recognized. It was a blend, part classical, part jazz, part memory. A theme emerged, elegant and melancholy, but it morphed subtly with each return, layering emotion on top of technique. She would move through a phrase that felt like Debussy, then pivot seamlessly into something almost gospel in tone, before resolving back into her original motif. It wasn't showy, it was honest. Her left hand created a foundation of warmth and stability, low, resonant, thoughtful. Her right danced above it with instinctive grace, never rushing, never overpowering. Her dynamics were precise, but never mechanical. Every swell of volume, every sudden hush felt lived in, like it belonged to her past. Somewhere near the third minute, a tear rolled down the cheek of a woman in the second row. She didn't know why. The melody wasn't sad in the conventional sense, it just spoke. Even Sebastian, standing near the edge of the stage, found his arms crossing slowly over his chest. His confident posture softened. There was no technique to critique, no flourishes to mock. This wasn't a performance meant to compete. It was one meant to reveal. As the piece moved into its final passage, Pam slowed even further. Each note became its own moment. The melody narrowed to a single line, barely more than a whisper, and then, with 3 descending notes that landed like sighs, she stopped. No lingering hand, no bow. She simply lifted her fingers from the keys and let the silence take over. The audience didn't clap. Not immediately. It was as if they couldn't. The stillness was too full. Then slowly, someone began to applaud. Then another. Then a wave of sounds swept through the room. Not raucous, but reverent. People stood not to cheer, but because it felt wrong not to. A few had tears in their eyes. A few others looked stunned. Pam stood, gave a slight nod, and stepped back from the piano. She didn't seek approval. She didn't need it. The music had spoken for her. Sebastian met her gaze again, but this time his expression had changed. The smirk was gone, replaced by something more complex: respect, surprise, maybe even humility. She gave him the faintest of smiles. No words. She didn't need them. The room continued clapping, but the air had shifted. What began as a challenge had become something else entirely, something no one could have predicted, and for the first time that evening, no one cared about winning. The applause finally faded, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with realization. People didn't just feel like they'd witnessed something rare, they felt like they'd been personally included in it. And as Pam stepped down from the piano, the crowd parted instinctively to let her through, not out of deference to her political stature, but because no one knew what to say. What do you say to someone who just changed the atmosphere in a room without speaking a single word? Elena stood near the side, her eyes wide. She had known Pam for years, had seen her dismantle prosecutors in court, disarm journalists in live interviews, and walk into chaos with the poise of a general. But she had never seen this side. Not like this. One by one, attendees approached Pam, not with handshakes but with gratitude. That was beautiful. I didn't expect that. Where did you learn to play like that? She answered politely, offering a warm smile but deflecting attention, redirecting praise. For her, this wasn't about being impressive. It was about being true. At the edge of the stage, Sebastian remained still. For a long moment, he simply watched her. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward through the applauding guests, crossing the space between them. When he reached her, the room quieted again, the air holding its breath. He extended his hand. Pam took it without hesitation. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I underestimated you," she smiled. "Most people do." He nodded once. No sarcasm, no bitterness, just understanding. And maybe for the first time in a long while, humility. The cameras, still rolling from the back of the ballroom, captured the handshake. The image would later go viral, two figures from opposite sides of the ideological spectrum, connected by something older and deeper than politics, music. From the side, a senator leaned toward a colleague. "That wasn't a duel," he murmured. "That was a masterclass." And just like that, the event resumed. The string quartet returned to their instruments. Drinks were poured again. Conversations restarted. But everyone knew something had shifted. The evening had begun as a gathering of influence. It ended as a reminder of substance. Pam walked back to her table, Elena joining her with an expression that landed somewhere between disbelief and admiration. "You really were going to keep that a secret forever, weren't you?" Pam shrugged. "I didn't think anyone would ask." Elena laughed. "They're asking now." Pam looked around at the room, the people, the cameras, the moment, and took a slow sip of water. Let them. And for the first time all night, she let herself relax. By sunrise, the video had already circled the internet twice. What had started as a shaky vertical recording from the back row of the ballroom was now a headline on every major platform. One version was titled "Pam Bondi silences the room with a piano," and it wasn't politics. Another, "Conservative icon destroys stereotypes in dueling performance." But the most shared version carried no title, no commentary, just 10 minutes of pure footage with a single caption. "Sometimes music says it better." The video spread across ideological lines like wildfire. Conservatives praised her talent, calling it proof of depth and elegance beyond the courtroom. Liberals, many of them skeptical at first, were caught off guard. Comments flooded the threads. "I don't agree with her politics, but this was something else." Others simply wrote, "Respect." Talk shows picked it up by noon. Clips of the handshake between Pam and Sebastian Hale played on cable news, overlaid with slow piano, music and expert commentary. "It wasn't about winning," one host said. "It was about revealing something real." And Pam Bondi did that with 10 fingers and no script. Pam, meanwhile, had flown back to Florida by mid-morning. She hadn't posted anything, no tweet, no press release, no comment. But her silence only added to the mystique. While others debated, reacted, and speculated, she stayed still. It made the moment feel even more powerful, like it didn't need her to explain it. Elena sat beside her on the flight, reading headlines aloud from her tablet. "They're calling it one of the most iconic moments of the year. Apparently, someone's already remixing your piece into a lo-fi YouTube loop." Pam chuckled. "That was fast." "You know this isn't going away, right?" Eleanor said. "They're going to start asking where it came from, why you never talked about it, what else you might be hiding." Pam turned to the window, her reflection overlaying the clouds. Let them ask, let them guess. By the time they landed, her inbox had tripled. requests for interviews, TV appearances, podcasts, piano festivals. A message from the Kennedy Center. Even Sebastian had sent her a text. Still processing. Let me know when you're ready to talk again. This time, no piano. She smiled faintly, but didn't reply. For Pam, the moment wasn't a launchpad. It was a reminder that even in a world addicted to noise and division, there was still space for something honest, something unexpected, and that sometimes the most radical act of defiance is beauty. By the end of the day, millions had watched, millions had commented, but none of them had heard what she played the way she felt it. Because that performance, above all, had been for herself, the interview requests kept piling up, but Pam remained quiet. Not because she had nothing to say, but because the story the world wanted, the viral, polished, media-ready narrative, wasn't the story she wanted to tell. This wasn't a strategy. It was something far older, far more personal. What most people didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Pam Bondi had grown up with music. Her father, Joseph Bondi, had been a public school music teacher in Tampa. He wasn't famous. He didn't play concert halls or record albums. But every Saturday morning, without fail, he'd sit down at the family's worn, upright piano and play as sunlight came through the kitchen windows. Not to impress, just to be alive. Pam would sit beside him, swinging her feet off the bench as he taught her notes, chords, phrasing. She learned to read music before she learned multiplication. By age 10, she could sight-read Chopin. By 12, she was writing her own little etudes in a spiral-bound notebook. But when Joseph passed suddenly, during her sophomore year of college, Pam stopped playing. She buried the keys under ambition. Law school, clerkships, courtrooms, political campaigns. Piano became part of a quieter life she no longer had time for, locked away in memory, like an old language she didn't speak anymore, until that night in Washington, until a smug comment from a stranger woke something she'd forgotten wasn't dead, only dormant. It wasn't rage that pushed her to the piano. It wasn't pride. It was memory. It was her father's voice saying, "Don't play louder, play clearer." It was the feel of ivory keys on small fingers, the sound of melody wrapping itself around emotion without needing permission or applause. Back home, alone in her living room, Pam stood in front of her late father's baby grand. It had been sitting in the corner for years, untouched. She lifted the lid, pressed a single key. It rang true. She sat, played the same theme from the gala, this time slower, simpler. The room filled with ghosts and warmth. A photo of her father rested on a nearby shelf, smiling mid-laugh in a frame worn from time. She looked at it, paused, and whispered, "I hope you heard it." And somehow she felt he had. In that moment, the headlines didn't matter. The retweets, the interviews, the assumptions, they all faded. What remained was something few ever see behind podiums and cameras. A woman reconnecting with the part of herself that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with purpose. That night in D.C. hadn't been about proving anything to anyone else. It had been about remembering who she was before the world told her what to be, and in doing that, she reminded the world of something it had almost forgotten. That genius isn't always loud. Sometimes it plays quietly and still, moves everyone who hears it. The world had returned to its usual noise. News cycles moved on, trending topics shifted. The next scandal arrived right on time. But for those who had seen it, really seen it, that night in Washington remained frozen in memory. A woman in a purple blazer, a quiet room, a piano, and something that couldn't be explained, only felt. Pam Bondi didn't seek to recreate it. She didn't ride the wave or cash in on the moment. Because for her, the moment was never about exposure. It was about truth, the kind of truth that doesn't scream, the kind that waits for silence so it can finally speak. She had reminded a room perhaps even a nation, that greatness isn't always broadcast, and brilliance doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it steps forward calmly, uninvited, and changes everything without saying a word. In the end, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about music. It was about remembering that identity is layered, talent is timeless, and sometimes the most unforgettable performances come from the most unexpected places, and that's what made it powerful. Because when Pam Bondi sat down at that piano, she didn't just play notes. She played history. She played defiance. She played home. And the world listened. If this story moved you, surprised you, or simply made you see Pam Bondi in a new light, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, unexpected stories like this one. Leave a like if you believe that talent speaks louder than titles, and tell us in the comments, what did you feel when she played? Because sometimes the quietest moments echo the loudest.